Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of the Study and Institute for IAS. My name is Aman Jha, and today we are going to take a class for Economic Survey 2020-2021. We will be covering both Volume 1 and Volume 2 chapter wise. First, we will focus on Volume 1 and we will mainly focus on areas that are relevant to civil service examinations. So, let's start. See, Economic Survey, as you know, mostly comes in Volume 1 and Volume 2. There are two volumes. Though some years ago they had compiled both of them and created one volume, but they have reverted back to the tradition. Simple thing, who releases Economic Survey? Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs. There has already been a question in prelims examination on who prepares the budget or which department prepares the budget. So, I would not be surprised if a similar question is asked about the Economic Survey. And remember, there are two sorts of economic advisors. There is one in Ministry of Commerce as well. So, let's move ahead. See, the first thing is, what is the relevance of Economic Survey? If you buy a printout from the market, be original or photocopy, you will see that it has a lot of factual data, a lot of graph data, and most of the students are from non-economic background in this examination. So sometimes they get confused that how should we use this, how should we utilize this, is there any relevant? I mean, there is not a very large precedence of asking direct questions from Economic Survey, but as you know that the nature of examination is always shifting and changing. So we can always expect questions in prelims, questions in mains, and questions in personality test as well. A simple example is this. In prelims exam, they can ask, what do you mean by bilateral netting? This term was used in last year's Economic Survey. Similarly, nudge theory. What is the nudge theory? What is the relevance of nudge theory in socio-economic development programs? Then twin balance sheet challenge. They will ask you that which two sectors of economy are involved in the twin balance sheet problem, or what is a twin balance sheet problem. Such questions can be asked in prelims examination. In last year's prelims examination, there was this question on interest coverage ratio. Similarly, so the idea is that a term based question in economy is not unprecedented. They can ask such questions. For mains, I have given this question. India's sovereign credit rating does not reflect its underlying strength. Discuss. As we go along, we will see in some chapters that Government of India has this time posed a direct question to the international sovereign rating agencies about their persistent bias against India and other developing countries. So we will see that in chapter. The second is the idea of inclusive growth is less relevant compared to the importance of economic growth. Do you agree? This year, due to the unique circumstances created by the COVID-19, government has decided to unabashedly focus on economic growth. And there is one chapter that talks about prioritizing growth over focusing on inequality. We will see that in that chapter also. So the idea is a question can be easily framed. See, the thing is, they would not ask a hardcore data-based question in mains. It's very unlikely. If the question comes, it might come on it might be a sector-specific question, say about agriculture, agricultural reforms, or reforms in IT sector, or reforms in FDI. There you can use the ideas from survey, or there could be such philosophical questions. I mean, this year's paper 3 started with a rather philosophical question in economy that talked about the intragenerational and intergenerational challenges of growth. So such questions can be asked in mains. In personality test, now personality test is very opinion based examination, right? You can see in that what is the so-called Atmanirbhar Bharat campaign. Suppose a panelist asks you this question, and do you see any significant impact of this campaign on economic policy making? As we go in this chapter, in the chapters of volume 1 as well as in volume 2, you will see many steps taken primarily on account of the impact of COVID-19 that correspond to this campaign. And do you think India has indeed made a V-shaped recovery? So then we will have to, because the term V-shaped recovery has become very popular. We will see later on what is a V-shaped recovery, what are the other shapes of recovery, which is desirable, which is undesirable. So such questions can be asked in personality test as well. So let's start with volume 1. See, volume 1 focuses on economic analysis to guide policy making. It is rather, you can say, it is a sort of economic philosophy. Of course, this economic philosophy is backed by hardcore analysis and data. They are not simply saying things for the sake of it. Each and every argument is analyzed and substantiated. For example, some years back, they came up with the idea of universal basic income. In that year's survey, the chapter went into detail in discussing what sort of universal basic income we can have as a developing country, what would it cost, what other changes we will have to bring in India's welfare system to make it sustainable. Then the idea of sun meta preference. It is a very, see, economic survey primarily appears to be an economic document, but it talked about a very unique social challenge which is unique to Indian society and its preference for sun, and it goes into detail and calculates how many unwanted girl child were born in that due to this sun meta preference. Same, we talked about nudge theory, which could be asked as a preliminary examination. Similarly, in mains also you can ask this. Then this Thalinomics, last year this idea appeared. So the economic analysis part is more important in volume 1. A 15-marker question can be easily framed. For example, UBI's pros and cons. You can ask, what are the pros and cons of UBI in India? Do you think it is feasible? Do you think what other changes government will have to make in India's welfare net system? Such things. And volume 2 mostly talks about recent developments in various sectors of economy of human development. For example, agriculture. What is the situation in foreign trade? What is the situation on inflation? What is the situation on the climate change front and India's mitigation and adaptation efforts? Industries, services, employment generations and such things. Recent developments in various economic sectors. So, chapter 1. The name of chapter 1 is Saving Lives and Livelihoods Amidst a Once-in-a-Century Crisis. Look, this year's budget as well as survey, they have been presented with the backdrop of Corona and its impact. And everywhere you will see the imprint of coronavirus. For example, the very first chapter, it is sort of an explanation of what government did, what was the rationale behind it, and what are the impacts of what they did. For example, they say stringent lockdown not only saved as well as it is saving lives, saving till now. But a V-shaped recovery has been possible precisely due to it. There has been a lot of debate that is there a V-shaped recovery? The survey says yes, there is. What is the argument behind it? We will see later on. Now, there have been a lot of questions that why the mortality, fatality rate or say case per million population has been low in India and other developing countries, and so many theories are going around. Some say about BCG vaccination, some say about innate immunity, some say about the in general low hygiene standards that might have ironically worked in India's favor and other developing countries. So, but what survey says, survey gives credit to the stringent lockdown. Now look, no document is purely academic. There is always politics involved. Now, do you want to believe or you don't want to believe? I think that question is irrelevant. Being a student for civil service examinations, you have to study and you have to prepare your answers and answer accordingly in examination. Whether the credibility of the document or the robustness of analysis is not, I have to say, is not relevant to civil service candidates. You just study, prepare, understand, and depending upon the question in examination, use the relevant data. That's all. Avoid political partisanship as far as possible. If something is given, if an assertion is made, understand what is the logic behind it and move on. So the whole chapter focuses on one and one thing only: justifying and explaining the steps during lockdown. A black swan event. Now swan are white and a black swan is very rare. So the point is, it's a black swan event. Why? Because it's very rare. Simple. So any rare event is called black swan event. The often repeated data points and unique vulnerabilities of India. See, there would be no one in this country at this point perhaps who does not know personally or who hasn't heard about somebody or a family getting impacted by coronavirus. Similarly, reading newspapers, reading magazines, reading commentaries on news channels, we all know what has happened since last 1 year. January 30 was into 2020 was the first case India registered, and since then the turn of events is well known. Same things here. What was the healthcare infrastructure status? Why government had to implement lockdown? Similar things, same things are repeated here, which you already know. Therefore, they have not been covered here. And unique vulnerabilities. Unique vulnerability in the sense that a dense population, very large population, things called network effects, the vulnerabilities of healthcare infrastructures, such things. Now, the world economy was already slowing down. 2019, the year of 2019 had witnessed the lowest growth rate. It was around 2.9%. It was lowest since GFC. That means, what is GFC? Global Financial Crisis of 2008. Since 2008, 2019 was already the lowest growth year. Why? Because trade war was going on between USA and China. In general, uncertainties related to WTO, climate mitigation impact, etc. These things were already bringing down global growth rate. And then Corona hit. Therefore, the IMF projects that in 2020, the entire world economy has contracted by 4.3%. 4.3% is estimation of World Bank and 3.5% is estimation by IMF. Now see, here itself, between 4.3% and 3.85%, there is a 0.8% gap. So the key message here is that projections are simply projections. There is no need to quarrel over them. Eventually, they might turn out to be something very different. Skeptics were saying that in second quarter, India's contraction will be very severe, but it turned out to be around 7%. And therefore, government is able to claim that we have achieved a V-shaped recovery. So, projections should not be a basis for argument. These are projections. Study it, reproduce it whenever necessary, and don't argue over these things. They're projections simply. And why it is a black swan event? This is the most important cause. 90% of the countries are in recession, which is more than the Great Depression, where only 85% of countries were in recession. Now we know the impact of Great Depression on the world economy. You all study history, for either it's your optional or not, but in GS it comes. We know what Great Depression did. It directly contributed to the rise of fascist groups like Hitler, Nazi Germany, Mussolini. So such was the impact of Great Depression. And in Great Depression, only 85% of the countries were in recession. This time, this is even higher. See, this is the graph. Here we are due to Corona. Okay. This was the Great Depression peak. This was a World War era. So you see, this is highest in this century. I mean, we don't need to think about what happened in 2008. It's a compared to what is happening in 2020, 2008 was rather mild. Now the document claims that yes, we have undergone short-term pain, but we have achieved long-term gains. The slogan was "Jaan hai to jahan hai." It loosely translates into first live, then we can reclaim the world later. Okay, and I picked it up verbatim here. What was the simple idea? Delay the peak. In India, peak, see, from Jan 2020, 30th Jan 2020 to roughly 15th September 2020. This much peak was delayed. Okay? This delay could only happen because of lockdown. Now, agreed, lockdown produced many adverse impacts. Many of them were not anticipated perhaps, but this is the government's or documents claim right now that we did delay the peak. Therefore, we prevented a collapse of healthcare infrastructure. If you recall that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, whenever he used to come on screen, there below his podium there would be a sticker which used to say that save NHS, it used to say. There would be a sticker below his podium, it will say save NHS. And even Britain had very strict lockdown measures. Even till now, when even during the Christmas period, which is so important for Western countries, they had to impose strict lockdown measures. They would say save NHS. Why? Because the idea is simple: delay the peak so that healthcare infrastructure doesn't get overwhelmed. And in the case of developing countries like India, that thing has to be looked after even more closely. And there were so many unknowns. See, there are two types of unknowns. This is I'm rather fond of this phrase. It's a unknown unknowns. And there is a known unknown. You know that you don't know something, but then there are some things that you don't know that you don't know. For example, we were never really sure about the innate immunity against the coronavirus. Earlier, some of the earliest assumptions about coronavirus turned out to be completely untrue. For example, that human beings, since it's a novel virus, human beings have no immunity against it. Then how come a llama animal in South America had it? That means there was some precedence of this virus. There were such many unknowns. There was a lot of talk about ventilators. Everyone was talking about there are no ventilators. How would we do? We have only few thousand ventilators. They are very costly. How can we produce them? Even rich countries like USA were suffering with the lack of ventilator. Later on, we realized that those who reach to that stage, the chances of their survival is very less. In most of the cases, they are lost cause anyway. So focus on early stages. Then new medicines were not discovered, rather reinvented, because they understood that they suppress the symptoms and the impact of COVID-19. Using steroids, using the medicine for AIDS, hydroxychloroquine, much ado about nothing, but it almost triggered a diplomatic crisis between India and USA, if you recall. So there were many unknowns. The RT-PCR test, costly, time-taking, without any alternative. So these are the arguments in the survey. See, a very important argument it makes that though yes, in India around 98% of population is below the age of 65, still that 8% of India's population, now out of 135 crore, that 8% which is elderly group, that is larger than USA and Russia combined. This is India's share. Here we are. This is India. This is India's elderly share. this is US, and this is Russia. So they said ki we cannot claim that, look, we have a young population, there is nothing to worry about. Of course, even the size of India's elderly population is still larger than many of these countries. And even now, this 8% of elderly population is producing 55 to 60% of positivities and fatality. So this idea is very important, that you cannot say simply being young we could be careless. We had a very old even our old population was very significant. Countries like Germany prevented this because in Western countries most of the elderly people live in care homes. So what they did, they simply isolated those care homes. They said ki no young people shall visit them. But in a country like India, where we have concept of joint families, there is no way to separate elderly population from the young and children. So these ideas should be remembered. It's a very good point that you can make in your mains examination if it comes to that. Okay, then this is a rather, I would say, controversial assertion, but the assertion has been made, and being a student, you are supposed to understand the logic behind it. That's all. If in examination a question comes, or in personality test if they ask, you have to know how you are going to use that example. For example, they say V-shaped recovery was, I think we have covered this point previously also, due to stringent lockdown. And the second point is more important. It says an interstate comparison adjusts for the favorable factors like BCG vaccination, embedded immunity, etc., and justifies the stringency of lockdown. See, the idea is that not only India, but many of the developing countries, almost entire South Asia, Southeast Asia, some of the countries in South America, and almost entire Africa, rather, I mean, worse was expected, but only bad happened. So the idea was that perhaps something else is also responsible for the better outcomes. Maybe the previous immunization programs impacted, like one idea was BCG vaccination. Those countries, there was a comparison between Spain and Portugal. Spain did badly because it had stopped giving BCG vaccines, and Portugal did well because BCG vaccine was still part of its immunization program. So such studies were given, but survey makes a point, okay, that may be a cause for overall good performance of India. But if you make an interstate comparison, see, because for entire Indian population those factors will be same, everybody. So they said ki if you make an interstate comparison, those states that implemented lockdown measures strictly and for a longer period did well compared to those states that were rather slow or their implementation was inconsistent. This is a good idea that can be used in examination. Again, there is no point for a student, I have to re-emphasize, there is no point in arguing whether this assertion is correct or not. You are not a political person, you are a student. Understand what is being said and use at relevant position. Now, this is about different shapes of recovery. Okay, V shape, U shape, swoosh, Z, W, L. This is most popular right now. What they say, that due to any external factors, if there is a precipitous decline, we should be able to jump as quickly as possible and come back on the same or even better growth trajectory. Though this much loss cannot be recovered even in V-shaped recovery. This much is gone. There are many other shapes. For example, this part is V-shaped, this much. Okay, but what if there is a second wave? Then again you will have to go into lockdown or similar measures, because social distancing. See, the difference between Great Depression and coronavirus is that people did not have to separate from each other. Whereas this time people had to end physical contact with each other. Therefore, this was the main reason for suffering. What if there is a second wave as being witnessed by many European countries? Then again there will be decline. Then again you will rise. And what if due to some reason you are never able to recover that growth rate, then you have this L-shaped recovery. Means once you go down, you will again rise. The growth will happen again, but you will not be on that growth trajectory. Say you used to grow at the rate of 7%, you decline, and now due to fall in demand, due to governance related problems, you don't never pick up that growth rate. So that is, I think we can easily say this is very undesirable and this is most desirable, and we can only hope right now that we don't experience any second wave. Then at the end of the chapter, government goes into the detailed measures that have been taken to address the difficulties faced by people. This table talks about in how much money was transferred through the direct benefit transfer schemes. PMJ women, if you recall, some amount was transferred directly to them. National Social Assistance Program, this is an older program. PM Kisan, a direct benefit transfer to farmers. Then support to building and construction workers, because they were among one of the worst affected segments of, perhaps the most affected segment of Indian population, migrant population. We all seen those migrant caravans, and building and other construction workers are almost always informal. They are part of it. Then EPFO, Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana. So under all these schemes, DBTs were made, and this list is given. This chart only shows that how there was a sudden peak in monthly average balance in PM accounts. Similar. Major structural reforms undertaken as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. Agriculture. Now we all know whether we are very uncertain about the future of these three laws, but we know they will still go into the history. Then they go into MSME sector, labor, business process outsourcing, power, PSU, minerals. These acts, labor reforms, for example, these three, the one on wages was already passed. These were already part of what we call structural reforms. These are structural reforms. They were proposed for a long time, under consideration at various stages of passing, but during this period they were passed. And then they have gone into, once you pick up your printout, you can see, and you can, if you recall some of them, you can write in mains. Work from home being promoted. This one, production linked incentive scheme, very much touted and rather successful. Because of this, we have seen recently that the extent of domestic manufacturing of mobile has picked up because of this. Then temporary suspension of IVC, because since the cash flow has had completely stopped, so there was a fear of bankruptcy. So government declared that after a threshold date, if a bankruptcy is claimed, it would not go to IVC. Faceless tax assessment, it was already in the pipeline, but it has been accelerated because of it. Empowered group of secretaries to fast track investment schemes. So look, these are necessary. These were already in the pipeline, but Corona rather expedited these steps. The V-shaped recovery. This is the crux. Why government says that there has been a V-shaped recovery? If someone asks you, either in interview or in mains, anywhere, that why you think there has been a V-shaped recovery, the document gives this answer, that in Q1 there was a minus 23.9% growth, unprecedented, and in Q2 it was minus 7.5. So this was the cause of a sudden decline and then a sudden up. And this is the crux. If anybody asks what is a V-shaped recovery and why you think India has undergone it, that would be your answer. Then we come to the chapter 2. Does growth lead to debt sustainability? Yes, but not vice versa. Now see why this chapter has been picked up. Why in this order? Why in a certain year UBI was discussed? Why in a certain year nudge theory was discussed? There is always a logic to it. This year, if you recall, the debate about fiscal sustainability, that means, in a nutshell, it means about controlling your fiscal deficit. The quality of spending is an implication of controlling your fiscal deficit. There have been a lot of ideas like, look, we should go for DBT, direct cash transfer, give cash to people, they will spend, that will generate demand, that will lead to growth. Nothing, just give cash. This has been tried in developed countries where countries like USA, where they don't have to worry about fiscal deficit, just print money, give to people. Then there was other idea which said, where should we focus? Should we focus on growth? Should we focus on redistribution? Some say, look, if we spend too much right now, it will lead to inflation, runaway fiscal deficit, and there will be a current account problem, such things, and it will cause a long-term problem. So this debate between growth and debt sustainability, what do we do in the immediate terms, has been going on for a while, and this survey through its chapter 2, 3 and 4 of volume 1 clearly points out that government is targeting growth in the immediate sense, and they said, look, if there is a growth, debt will remain sustainable, the debt level will remain sustainable, it will become sustainable even if there is a short-term problem. But if there is no growth, then debt level will decline, there will be a problem here. Sorry, decline in the sense the quality of debt will decline, the fiscal deficit problem will persist or even exacerbate. See, fiscal deficit projections 1920 9.5%, and they are saying ki it will be, this is the revised estimate, that this has been the deficit, and this is the budget estimate for next year. Sorry, I think the dates were slightly messed up. This should be okay. So they say ki they are admitting that due to coronavirus, their fiscal deficit is as much as 9.5%, and they are not claiming that suddenly we will bring it down to 6% or 5% or not 5% or 4% or 3%. If you recall, FRBM Act says ideally that fiscal deficit should be 3% with a 1% escape clause during the to counter the cyclic effect. However, not only they admit that in 2020, 2021, the growth was, these dates were wrong. Not only the deficit was 9.5%, it is going to remain in the red zone during in the budget estimate. It is going to be at 6.8%. And the government says only in the long term, we are going to bring it down to 3 to 4%. That means the idea is simple. We are going to focus on growth. If there is growth, debt sustainability can be achieved, but you cannot say that simply by retaining a sustainable debt level, we can have growth. This is the idea behind this chapter. And now we are going to see how they substantiate this point. Now, need for fiscal stimulus due to COVID-19. Debt sustainability depends on the interest rate growth rate differential. This is a very good term. You can expect there may be a question in prelims, there may be a question on mains or in personality test, but it's a good term. It's important to understand it. Now, IRGD, interest rate growth rate differential, is the difference between interest rate and the growth rate in an economy. Okay, this is here. Monetary policy rate or market interest rate, they are at the, they correspond to each other, and growth rate. Now, they say that there is a dichotomy between developed and developing states. Though both have negative IRGD, in developed countries, it is due to low interest rates. See, in a developed country, you will say annual growth rate. In USA, there might be 2%, 3%. In European Union, there would be 1%, 2%. So growth rate is low. But policy rates are even lower. There was a period when European Central Bank maintained a negative policy rate. That means if you deposit your money in bank, there would be no, you would not be paid any interest on that. So they say both have negative IRGD, but developed countries have negative IRGD because their monetary policy rates are very low, and developing countries like India have negative IRGD because their growth rate is higher than their policy rates. Okay, say for example, our policy rate is repo rate. Say it is 5%, and in that year we have achieved a 7% growth rate. Then it would be minus 2%. And they say a negative, as long as IGRD is negative, you don't need to worry about sustainability of debt. Debt will remain sustainable in the long term. Given India's growth potential, we all know that India has the potential to grow at 7 to 8%, and if there are proper structural reforms, we can hit as high as 9 to 10%. So, given India's growth potential, debt sustainability is not a problem even in the worst scenario. Fiscal stimulus needed while structural reforms show effect. For example, these agricultural reforms, though they have run into controversy now, but any reform takes time to show its effect. Bankruptcy code took time to show its effect. Disinvestment or liberalization of economy or ease of doing business, these reforms take time to show their effect. Meanwhile, you need a fiscal stimulus. You need government to spend so that spending creates additional demand, which will be filled by then private investment. And during all this, earnings will increase, savings will increase, then there will be more money to invest, channel back into the economy. Therefore, fiscal stimulus is currently needed because right now the focus has to be on growth. If there is growth, debt level will remain sustainable. But there is a caveat. What is caveat? That the quality of your fiscal spending is very important. And as we see in the budget, there has been a lot of focus on infrastructure, dedicated freight corridors, defense capital acquisition, railway infrastructure, there are railway blueprint, etc. So the quality of spending is very important. Meaning you should invest. See, as we know, there are two kinds of expenditures and incomes, capital and revenue. Capital expenditure and capital investment is good for economy. It creates more demand. The capital expenditure creates more demand, whereas a revenue expenditure simply leads to consumption but does not create more demand. Say for example, a direct benefit transfer is a sort of, in immediate terms it will boost consumption, but that will not be sustainable. But if you invest in infrastructure, if you invest in schools, if you invest in hospital, if you invest in railway, then that will enable the economy to reach a higher level of growth. So it says that fiscal stimulus should not be fiscal irresponsibility. I mean, you cannot say that, okay, let's increase the salaries of government employees or just make a one-time transfer. It will boost demand only in the short term. Now, in a developed country, there is less hunger or less scope for infrastructure investment. Infrastructure is already world class. There is not much scope. But in a country like India, where the logistics cost, I mean, there is a according to World Bank's logistics index, in India, if roughly the logistics cost is roughly 13 to 40% of the overall cost of the final value of any good. But if we bring it out under say 9 to 10% the logistics cost, then it will lead to much saving in the economy. The idea is there is scope for infrastructure investment, and that is a sustainable investment. So the counter-cyclic fiscal policy. Now see, fiscal policy two type: pro-cyclic, counter-cyclic. Now what it does at the time of recession, meaning GDP is declining, what we are facing right now. Expansion, GDP is increasing. Growth rate is increasing. Now a pro-cyclic policy, that means it will accentuates or exacerbate the problem. What it does? At the time of recession, it is contractionary. Government cuts down its expenditure and raises the taxes. Now, why governments are forced to do so? That is sometimes primarily because government is unable to maintain its own expenses. It's like, okay, there is so much problem in the economy that they cannot follow counter-cyclic policy, and inevitably it becomes contractionary in that case. So government expenditure declines and taxes go up. But if it was counter-cycling, meaning it is trying to reduce the bad effects, government will raise its expenditure. If you remember the idea of New Deal, this became famous during the 1929 economic depression. President FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt of USA, introduced this idea. It expanded the government expenditure and reduced the taxes. There is another word called Keynesian economics. The New Deal was based on Keynesian economics, named after John Maynard Keynes, and this idea is still very relevant. At the time of declining growth rate, and right now we are not only facing decline, we are facing rather a contraction. Most of the economies have faced recession. You are supposed to, this is good. For the sake of simplicity, this is bad. You are not supposed to be pro-cyclical, you are supposed to be counter-cyclical. Okay? At the time of recession, adopt expansionary policy. The chapter and the budget advocates this. At the time of expansion, follow contractionary fiscal policy, meaning reduce your expenditure, raise your taxes. Why? Because after a while the economy starts heating up. If you recall, in the post 2008 crisis, the government of India followed an expansionary policy to adopt a counter-cyclic approach, but after a while it could not stop itself. It could not reduce its expenses and did not raise taxes. So what happened? Overheating happened. NPA problem is a direct result of not being able to adopt a contractionary fiscal policy when the GDP growth rate went up. Softens the recession, moderates the expansion, because simply an unbridled growth, it leads to heating in economy. Inflation takes place and then it slows down. So better at the time of expansion, reduce your expenses. If you had a fiscal deficit of 4%, 5%, bring it down to 3% is considered ideal for countries like India. Raise your taxes, increase your income. Pro-cyclic, see, no government would intentionally adopt a pro-cyclic policy, but due to the unique, rather say almost entirely because of the political structure of that country, they end up using these populist measures. So this is here again the idea that this is a black swan event. If we don't adopt an expansionary fiscal policy right now, then when will we do it? Okay, see, this is the normal trajectory, no policy action. Okay, there is expansion and then there is contraction. A pro-cyclic policy exacerbates effects in both cases. What it does, again for the sake of simplicity, let's say Sorry, this is bad. Okay. It exacerbates effects in both cases. During expansion, growth increases. Then at the time of slowdown, growth declines further. Okay. So it's like when you have abundance, you eat so much that it gets bad for you. And the counter-cyclic policy, what it does, it stops the economic engine from hitting. If the at the time of expansion and at the time of contraction, it reduces the impact of contraction. Now it's a rather simplified calculation. It says ki suppose government borrows 100 rupees at this point. Now we know there is no demand. There is not much demand in the economy right now. Therefore, private investment is not picking up. If you recall, before Corona, government gave a very large tax break to the corporate sector. The hope was that the corporate sector will use that increased income to reinvest in the economy. But they could not do so or did not do so for two reasons. First, there was no incremental demand. They saw no demand for increasing their investment. Second, the inventory levels were so high, meaning that they could produce more from the same infrastructure. Say, if there is a car company that could produce 1 crore cars per year, but right now because of a slowdown, they are producing only 70 lakh cars. So without increasing their investment, they can meet if there is any demand. So they say that their inventory levels are high. You have already stocks, but there is no demand, so that stock is available. So because of the rising inventory levels and lack of, or rather reduced demand in the economy, corporate sector did not choose to reinvest that money they saved from tax breaks. Something, not entirely, but something similar may happen here. That if you think we should not raise the fiscal deficit because that will increase the market interest rates and that will make it difficult for private sector to borrow. But the thing is, there is not much demand in the economy right now. Therefore, government has to step up. What they say, suppose government borrows 100 rupees. Okay. And they say investment. Now it is very important that you invest in productive areas. Okay. In areas like infrastructure, health, education, etc. Roads. They say that will generate 112. Now they go into very detailed calculations to arrive at these figures. Very detailed mathematical and statistical models are there. Research papers are there for a typical civil service students. You just understand it broadly. Do not bother about those detailed calculations. Simply take the idea and use it where you have to. What they say, ki you raised this much money from the market and due to it this much income was generated. Now at the end of 1 year, since the market rates are low because the economy has slowed down, you have to pay back 108. What is this additional 8? This is the interest. On 100 rupees you had to pay some interest, and this is the return on your investment. The balance is, you will have, this is the plus in the economy. Okay. Same, repeat the step in year 2. However, suppose this would not work in a case where either this was low or this was high. If the market rates were very high, which is not the case right now. Right now the market rates are so low, as you can see in your fixed deposits account, in your returned RD FD accounts, in your savings account, or in the market interest rate you borrow from the market, the rates are low. There is not much demand for the loan right now. So if interest rates were high, and they will be high when the growth picks up, or there is hitting in the economy, or the return on the investment is low. Now that return could be low for two reasons. One, you invested in unproductive areas, for example in salaries. You gave salary, there was a one-time bump in consumption, but that's about it. Or for some reason, for example in case of India, often the infrastructure projects are delayed. Okay, some time back there was a report in news that in some cases as much as 100% cost overrun happened. So what if instead of 112.8 you only generated a return of 106.8? Then this calculation would not work. But given the current circumstances, the current unique circumstances created by COVID-19, the calculation is that there will be good return provided fiscal stimulus does not turn into fiscal irresponsibility. So this will remain positive in near term. Then this correlation between growth and debt sustainability is only a one-way correlation. Means if there is growth, the debt levels remain sustainable. However, we cannot say that vice versa is also true. Meaning you simply cannot keep debt levels sustainable and hope that there will be growth. There is negative correlation between the two, as we will see in the next graph, but the direction of that negative correlation is not clear. We will see it right now. Now, changes in IRGD are mostly attributable to changes in growth rates rather than the changes in interest rates. Meaning what we had seen, IRGD is interest rates in the market or policy rates. You can use whichever term. Now, what it is saying that changes in IRGD in the case of developing countries like India are mostly attributable to changes in growth rates rather than changes in interest rates. So, if this goes up, IRGD will remain negative or go further deep in negative, or if this comes down, then the IRGD will increase. Heavy borrowing will raise market interest rates. Obviously, as we see, if government borrows more and more from the market, then the policy interest inflation will go up. The availability of financial savings in the market to reinvest in the market will reduce. Therefore, eventually the policy rates go up. So overall, the interest rates in the market go up. But the ensuing growth will keep the IRGD negative. Even when the interest rates grow up, the growth will grow further up. So IRGD will still remain negative, and as long as it is negative, you don't need to worry about debt sustainability. Crowding out won't happen due to fiscal multipliers. What are fiscal multipliers? What we saw there, that a 100 rupee investment will generate around 112.8 return. These are fiscal multipliers. For example, if you refurbish a road, if you build a dedicated freight corridor, you will bring down logistics costs. If you bring down logistics costs, there is more incentive to invest in manufacturing. Okay, so these are fiscal multipliers. Provided you invest, you make capital expenditure. So crowding out would not happen. That if there is growth, there will be opportunity for private sector to invest. There will be increase in income of households. Therefore, more saving, more investment, more growth. That will keep happening. Crowding out would not happen. Means, now what is crowding out? Crowding out happens when the market interest rates go so up that private sector thinks that we don't have this rate of interest is not attractive, we would not be able to recover our investments. But they say, since right now interest rates are so low that even if they go up, the growth rate will go still further up, IRGD will remain negative, and due to it, private sector will find it attractive to borrow and invest. Rather, crowding in take place. Crowding in means whatever investment we make, it will enable or facilitate private sector or incentivize private sector to borrow from the market and invest, because and a virtuous cycle of growth, meaning this will happen. Now this figure was used in last economic survey. It talked about that how we should invest. We should first focus on capital investment, which will generate economic growth. Growth will increase consumption. Consumption will again create demand. Demand for investment. So right now they are saying first start with public investment. Okay. First start with public investment. This will create economic growth. Economic growth will increase consumption. Due to increased consumption, what will happen? There will be more demand. And that demand will incentivize private sector to borrow even at an increased interest rate to invest in the economy. Therefore, they say crowding out would not happen, crowding in would happen. Private sector will not be pushed out from this virtuous cycle of growth. It will be rather attracted, it will join the growth cycle. Now, the idea that the direction of negative correlation, as we said, there is a negative correlation between growth rate and debt sustainability. That means if real growth rate has declined, we can say that debt sustainability has also declined. And if debt sustainability has declined, we can say that real growth rate has also declined. Now listen carefully. However, the direction of this correlation is not clear. Okay, what is the cause and what is the effect? In one direction, growth leads to sustainability, debt sustainability, that is clear. But is debt sustainability or does debt sustainability leads to growth? That correlation is not clear. There is negative correlation, but the direction of that correlation is not clear. It is only, they say, contemporaneous relationship between GDP growth and change in general government debt for India. We see there is a negative correlation, means if there is more growth, debt changes in debt to GDP, it comes into negative. It is correct. But however, we cannot say that simply because we have retained debt at a sustainable level, there will be growth. See, changes in debt to GDP in percentage, there is increase and there is decrease. Mostly there is decrease, so the growth rate is also higher. Okay, but what is the cause? Is debt sustainability due to growth? That correlation has been established, but here the other way around is not clear yet. An example is Asian financial crisis. From financial year, now in late 1990s there was an Asian financial crisis. This was the crisis before the global financial crisis of 2008. This was the most important crisis before 2008. They say from financial year 1908, that means, what it means is this. When I say financial year 98, it means this. To financial year 2003, it means 2002, 2003. Growth was an average 5.3%. It for South Asia. This started with ASEAN countries and then it spread to the rest of the world. And this example is also for ASEAN countries. The growth was an average 5.3%, but a consistent fiscal push. Now, due to this push, there was a temporary rise in debt levels. Certainly, if you to give fiscal stimulus, you have to borrow from the market. So, at least for the short run, there will be rise in the debt level. A consistent fiscal push, which also led to temporary rise in debt, imparted an average 8%. So, from 5.3%, it went to 8% in the next few years. Yani financial year 2004, that means from 2003-2004 to, and what happened at this point? The global financial crisis struck. So due to consistent fiscal push, it says that average growth rate went up from 5.3% to 8%, and the debt level came down from 83% to around 73% at this point. Therefore, we know that a sustained average growth maintains debt sustainability. However, we cannot say that a sustainable debt level will automatically lead to growth, increased growth. They happen together, but is it a cause? That has not been established. Now, rather a factual data it is that, but I kept it in the lecture because there may be a question based on such data. And see, there have been questions like the India's tax to GDP ratio has consistently increased, or India's fiscal deficit has consistently declined. So UPSC has not shied away from asking such fact-based questions. Similarly, I found this good graph, debt to GDP ratio for India among the rest of the world. See, there are different figures and often we get confused between them. Total debt as a percentage of GDP. Now, of course, it will include public sector as well as private sector, state government as well as central government. It is 120.9%. Total debt as a percentage of GDP. Then, government debt as a percentage of GDP, it is 63%. And if you remember the NK Singh committee report, it says that it should be ideally near 60% with 40% central and 20% state. So it is rather high, and in near terms it is not going to go down, it will only increase for obvious reasons. And then private debt as a percentage of GDP, this is 52%. So if you add these two, it will roughly be equal to that part. So there could be a question, for example, if I ask that in private debt as a percentage of GDP in India is higher than private government debt as a percentage of GDP, it will be an incorrect statement because it is 54% and this is 68%. You remember there are questions where they give you two statements and they ask you only one is true, only two is true, both are true, and neither. So there could be such questions. Then this composition of general government public debt. Center's share is 70%, state share is 30%. Composition of central government debt. See, 94% is internal. And from this point, we will pick up the next chapter where what says. And only 6% is external. So they say, look, our debt levels are sustainable, don't worry. And this idea is carried forward to the next chapter as well. Again, the reason this was picked because there could be a question that India's external liability is more than internal, and in the heat of the moment you might think, oh yes, India's growth level is low, so therefore this problem could exist. But that is not true. India's debt level, external debt exposure is very comfortable. What we heard about Greece or Spain some years back during Eurozone crisis, in their case the chart was almost reverse. Their external debt was much higher than their internal debt. In fact, in India there is so much resistance to borrowing from external sources that last year's budget even proposed borrowing from outside, but there was bureaucratic and political economic resistance to it, and that idea was silently buried. Chapter 3. Does India's sovereign credit rating reflect its fundamentals? Now, few things to understand. What is a sovereign credit rating and what are our fundamentals? And answer you can already see. It says no. Now, why? Why this chapter is there? Because in last two chapters we saw, in first, government said that yes, there has been a V-shaped recovery, but situation is delicate and we have to spend and spend wisely. So in first two chapters, this idea has been conveyed. But there is always a risk of outside actors influencing that resolve. Mainly outside actors like sovereign credit rating agencies. What they do, if they see some problem, they will suddenly reduce your sovereign credit rating, and that will cause some turbulence in financial market. It's rather unnecessary or rather nasty situation sometimes. It is a pet peeve of the government. Means even in previous surveys, governments have highlighted this point that these rating agencies, in short, we can say CRA, credit rating agencies. This government has even previously said that these CRAs don't treat us fairly. The ranking or the rating they give us does not reflect the India's underlying strength. But this time there is a separate chapter, and it is almost like a warning to them that look, yes, our growth rate is low and it would not pick up immediately. Our fiscal deficit level is high and it will remain so for some time. So don't be naughty. This is a international scenario. We are not an exception. We are the rule right now. Don't come after us and reduce our rating even further, because you have already a low credibility and we will not be deterred even if you reduce our rating. And they have started with Rabindranath Thakur's comment, rather statement, that we should be fearless. Mind should be without fear. So the message is simple, that don't worry about rating, focus on domestic situation. It raises a very important point that fifth largest economy in the world has been rated as the lowest rung of investment grade, the triple B minus or Baa3. Now we will see a chart of these ratings. China similarly happened in the case of China. When China became the fifth largest economy, it was also rated very low. This was the case of China. China is here. When China became the fifth largest economy, its rating was at this point. And when India became the fifth largest economy, its rating is here. Now they say normally fifth largest economy is in this group, much higher rating. They say China was treated differently, and similarly India is also being treated differently. In India's case, even worse. Now what are the parameters of sovereign rating? Growth rate. See, last year, due to a decline in India's growth rate, one of the rating agencies reduced India's rating, as if that was only India's case, whereas this has been happening across the globe. Inflation level. Now we have a monetary policy committee, we have a monetary policy framework that targets a 4% plus or minus 2% interest rate, and this has been largely maintained except the second half of last year because of the supply side shocks due to pandemic. But especially after the monetary policy framework, India's performance has been very good on this. General government debt. We saw in previous graphs that general government debt level is very comfortable. Current account balance. Ironically, during pandemic and for some months even before that, India's current account deficit has been in plus. That means our exports have declined, but our imports have declined even further. So the current account balance is currently in plus. And in any case, India has managed it rather well in last few years. Political stability, certainly. Now you might have your political opinion about country's conditions. However, as far as stability is concerned, we come immediately after, say, Western European and North American countries. I would rate India's political stability higher than, say, a China or a Turkey. Rule of law, control of corruption, investor protection, ease of doing business. A World Bank report has improved. India is almost into the top 50. All right, we started out in lower 130s and we are almost in the top 50s. Short-term external debt, forex reserve, which is touching $600 billion now. it is around what, 580 something right now, very close to 600. Sovereign default history, zero. India has, in the history of independent India, India has never defaulted. It is in fact, especially on this point, sovereign default history. Look, this is something cultural. In India, we do not like to default. Okay? It is considered a rather immoral thing. Whereas without overtly criticizing some countries in South America or Europe, they have a history of defaulting persistently. Whereas in India's case, zero. India has never defaulted. Now, what we counted here, these around 12 parameters. The survey says India has been an outlier on all these parameters, not only now, but also during the last 2 decades. It says, look, that what it says that this problem of misrating or underrating India's sovereign credibility is not a recent phenomena. It has been happening for last 2 decades, and on each parameter it has given graphs. There are total 12 graphs, and in each of them India is an outlier. Now there is no point in reproducing them one by one. That will be only adding slides. They have given detailed graphical rebuttal. We will see only one or two. That on all the 12, not only one or two, on all the 12 parameters, it says India is an outlier. That means, given India's position, India should be rated higher. Now, past instances of ratings change made no impact on sentiment. This is rather something bold to say, or almost a challenge. That look, if you want to change rating, fine, go ahead. But you have not been able to impact Sensex, you have not been able to impact forex, foreign exchange rate, and you have not been able to impact even yield on government securities. The only impact, if there is on FPI flows. FPI flows into equity and debt, and we can manage without it. So they say, look, don't act mischievous, but even if you do, you have not been impactful in the past, you won't be now. Now, this is the chart. There are few. There is FIT and S&P. Some say Fitch, some say FIT, I don't know. And then there is Moody's. Now, here I have written this word, The Big Short. There was this movie some time back, a Hollywood movie by Christian Bale, Ryan Gosling, very good, very fine actors. They talk about that how immediately before the 2008 global financial crisis, the same rating agencies were giving AAA rating to those bonds, those corporate bonds that crumbled like a house of cards when the financial crisis hit. There is a very good scene in the movie where one of the lead actor asks one of the executives of one of rating agencies. They say, why are you doing it? Why you are not doing due diligence? And she says, look, we are indulging them simply because if we don't give them good ratings, they will go to someone else. So if these agencies operate on these principles, is there any need to bother about them? Survey indirectly says no, don't bother about them. They have been unfair to us in the past, and even if they are unfair to us now, it won't matter. There are few highest quality. Normally, USA's bonds are rated in this category because of dollar. They don't have to worry about defaulting, simply print more and pay back. Only recently, some agencies, due to a very high level of political uncertainty in USA, had reduced the ranking from AAA to just below rank. But it did not last for long. Then strong payment capacity. Most of the middle income countries are here. Most of the middle income countries. And then these BBB plus, BBB minus. India is here. India is here. And below this point, the speculative category starts. Speculation means you are taking a risk. You are taking a risk in buying the government bonds of these countries. Now, for higher risk, there is a higher return. Okay, these are speculative categories. India is at the lowest rank in the investment grade securities. This is so if we go below this, we will come back into the speculative category. Means if you want to take a gamble so that you may lose all your money, you may earn very high amount on the interest. So these are speculation, and India is at the lowest rung of investment grade bonds. And survey says this is blatantly unjust. Now, there could be a mains question. It could go like this, that the idea of a sovereign credit rating is unsuitable to economies like India. Do you agree? As we say, if you go into the survey, you will see that, okay, why this is unsuitable to economies like India. You will see how fundamentals are different, how at the same levels of economy, different countries are treated separately than India. So there you can give that those arguments. And if they ask a more direct question, they will say, what is a sovereign credit rating? Enumerate the parameters considered for assigning such a rating. Now, we have taken only one parameter, GDP growth. There were around 11 to 12 parameters, and survey has given graphical representation to rebut all that on all parameters. India is an outlier. India is being treated unfairly. See what it shows. GDP growth, India is here between 5% to 7.5%. Okay. Now, normally if you are below this line, you are being treated harshly, and if you are above in terms of ranking, and if you are above this line, say this or this, the agencies are very lenient to you. They will say, and it is says that look, India is here. That means despite a high growth rate, okay, between 6 to 7% range, despite it, look, our rating is so low. We should be on this line or somewhere near to this line. Similarly, it says not only this, it has given in 2010 India was here, in 2020 it was here, 2015, 5, 10. So it says that during the past 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, from 2001, 2000 to 2020, it says that India has been a consistent outlier. We are much below this line. Our annual average rating is here. See, we should be either here or slightly above it. Now, going back slightly, say this question. They say the idea of sovereign credit rating is unsuitable to economies like India. Do you agree? Now, suppose you want to agree, you say that yes, on all those 11, 12 parameters, India's performance is way above the rank it is being assigned. But still you have to give some counter arguments that what could be the thinking behind those agencies. So you could say that yes, India is indeed a fifth largest economy, but India's per capita income, now I don't know where would it land after this unprecedented decline in economy, but before it was somewhere near $2,100. Now they say that after a 7 to 10% decline, it will come in the range of $1,800 to $1,900 per annum per person. They say this is even below the middle income countries. Okay, so yes, in absolute terms, we are indeed the fifth largest economy, but our per capita income and the consequent parameters like education, literacy, health, etc. are very low. But this is not the forte of these CRAs. They are supposed to look at one thing and one thing only: the ability of a government to pay back its debt. As we have seen in previous graphical representations, India sits very comfortably in terms of its external debt exposure, both private sector and public sector. India's entire private debt could be paid off. In the short term, private debt could also be paid off with the available reserves. So this is one counter argument that yes, we are indeed the fifth largest economy. The per capita income is very low. Second, you could say that in areas like corruption, rule of law, there are other indexes that rank India rather low. So there is another counter argument. So when the question is, do you agree? I would recommend that you should agree, because this has been the trend for a while. But say you have to give one or two counter arguments, then you can give that yes, India is fifth largest economy, but the per capita income is very low. India's other things, like you could say India's share in the global trade, especially the merchandise trade, that is also very low. It's less than 3% in global trade, to around 2% something. So you can give such counter arguments. Now here, the impact of rating on sentiments. See, the key word is sentiment. Economy is not only maths, it is also expectations. The expectation of what will be the demand level. If you hope or if you think that demand will go up, you will invest. What will be the inflation level? If you think that inflation is going to increase, you will buy immediately, or if you think it is going to decrease, you will postpone your spending. So economy is not only about data, it is also about sentiment. When something like sovereign rating goes up or goes down, it impacts market sentiments. Say an adverse political event take place, a war starts somewhere. Say, for example, some crisis in West Asia, immediately oil prices go up out of expectation without any immediate drop in the oil output. Oil prices go up, then entire economy will be affected. Then they expect okay, since the oil prices has gone up, certain sectors like automobile, etc., they should face problems. They should face a drop in sales. So their their share market in their equity prices go down. So economy is, apart from maths, there is a lot of sentiment involved, which is used in behavioral economics, the things like nudge theory, etc. Now, the summary of average changes in select indicators during India's sovereign credit downgrades. I mean, there have been few downgrades. One, there was at the time of Pokhran, okay, and one recently due to declining growth rate. See, it says here the short term, medium term, long term. In long term, despite a downgrade, Sensex returns and exchange rates have gone up. So, what is the impact? In government security yield, since this word has been coming so much in newspapers and in surveys, you should understand this terminology. It will be useful in prelims. It is a kind of return on investment in debt security. Since the interest rates are fixed on a bond, but the price of that bond goes up and down. For example, so if the price goes up and down, say if you bought a bond in 100 rupees and the interest was 10%, so the yield is 10. But for some reason, if the price of bond goes down, you bought the same bond at the cost of 90 rupees, so the yield goes up. Then the income goes up. The only area where the effect is clearly seen is in FPI flows, yani foreign portfolio investment. There you can clearly see that red indicates negative outcomes, green indicates positive outcomes. Only here a rating downgrade has a pronounced long-term impact on both equity and debt flows. Now, summary of average changes during the period of upgrades. Again, a very mixed picture in the case of Sensex returns and exchange rates. Here, once again, only FPI flows, meaning it is only the foreign investor that cannot be bothered or to look into the deep fundamentals, that looks at the credit ratings and decides whether to invest in equity or debt or not. Now, noisy credit ratings damage FPI flows, as we have seen that in case of both downgrade and upgrade, in the long term the impact on FPI is very clear, but no clear impact on GSEC yield exchange rates and Sensex. Therefore, the Financial Stability Board, it is an international organization, could be asked in prelims, look into it, is focusing on assessing the pro-cyclicity of credit rating downgrades. Means what you do during the phase of slowdown, you exacerbate slowdown. During the phase of why? By reducing the ranking immediately. During the phase of acceleration, increase growth rate, you again accelerate it further by giving the higher rating. So it is pro-cyclic. They say ki is it, especially it is very hurtful for developing countries that need stability in such ratings. So the crux is do not panic. Yes, the situation is dire, fiscal deficit is up, it is going to remain up because we have to borrow more to invest in growth, which may not pick up immediately. Therefore, these agencies may misbehave again. However, their impact is not clear. So don't bother, don't panic. That is the message of this chapter. Chapter 4, Inequality and Growth, Conflict or Convergence. Look, this chapter is an unabashed admission of economic conservatism. It clearly says that focus on economic growth. If economic growth happens, poverty levels will come down, and in meantime, if inequality increases, that is okay. We will look into it later. Right now, do not bother about inequality, focus on growth. Let's see what it says. Inequality and growth, conflict or convergence. Now there is a very famous quote that says a rising tide lifts all the boats. But later the proponents of social justice argued that it depends on your boat. Yes, we are in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. A rising tide will not lift all the boats. I think this chapter says something like this. A rising tide lifts all the boats, though all the boats need not be lifted equally. This says that we are developing economy, we are supposed to reduce poverty, and in the process, if inequality increases, we have to live with it. Now, see, inequality is a moral dilemma, and just like so many problems or the awareness of problems, this debate has also started in the West. Okay, in Western countries, for example, Oxfam recently published a report. I mean, this is rather old data from 2017, very much used. It says that in 2017, 1% of the rich bagged 73% of wealth. Okay, remember, there's a difference between wealth and income. It recently says that even during the pandemic, the rich grew richer while the poor suffered. And this was rightfully a cause of indignation, rather ironical, because due to the resources they had, the rich were able to, insulate themselves from the impact of pandemic. But poor have no way. I mean, we all saw the migrant caravans. People lost jobs, lost incomes, they had to cut down on their expenses, pushed into poverty because of out-of-pocket expenditure, etc. Inequality as a moral question. Look, in pre-modern societies, inequality was, it might be a rather controversial statement, but in pre-modern societies, inequality was accepted as part and parcel of life. But modern societies believe in human rights, believe in the dignity of individual, we believe in democracy, we believe in equality. Therefore, inequality is a failure of modernity. Most of us, and I think there is nothing wrong to hope that the world should be as equal as possible. But this chapter raises some questions. It questions that notion that should developing countries who have a very large number of poor people, should we focus on reducing inequality or lifting people out of poverty? Now, where is this contradiction? We will see in the chapter. See, Another dichotomy with the West. One we saw in case of interest rate growth differential, that why it was negative in their case and why it was negative in our case. The reasons were different. In their case, market interest rates and policy rates are low, therefore it is negative. In our case, because of high potential for growth rate, it is negative. The second dichotomy is that look, they have low growth rate and low poverty rate in the West. Therefore, they tend to focus on inequality. Okay. Also, they know that inequality is, okay, we'll come back here. They say in developed countries, low growth rate, 2%, 3%, and low poverty rate. So what the problem is? Problem is inequality. Okay. That means the gap between the richer and poorer is much sharper. Now, higher growth rate potential and larger potential to lift people out of poverty in developing countries. We know we have the potential to grow as high as 9 to 10% provided we take the right steps. And still in our case, we have around 27% people which are multidimensionally poor. So, we want an equal society, but still there are people who are below poverty line and we could uplift them with the help of economic growth. Now, what happens? That recently economists like Thomas Piketty, they have been highlighting this problem of inequality, and they have highlighted, especially in the case of West, that economic growth has is not much impactful on socio-economic parameters. Reducing inequality is more important in the case of West. For improved socio-economic indicators like education, health, infant mortality, maternal mortality, crime rate, drug abuse, for such problems, reducing inequality is more important than more economic growth. That is the case of West. But in our case, economic growth has a greater impact on poverty alleviation than focusing on inequality. Therefore, this is the crux of, I will say, I have to summarize, India must focus on growth to uplift the poor. He said, yes, there will be some inequality, but right now, don't need to bother about it, focus on growth. Though the survey uses the word pie, but pie is not that much famous in India, pizza is. So let's understand from it. A bigger pizza can be distributed feasibly. Okay. So they said ki first increase the size of pizza, then we will think about distribution. Higher inequality leads to poor socio-economic outcomes. This is the case of developed countries as highlighted by economists like Thomas Piketty. On the other hand, per capita income, which is a measure of economic growth, has little impact. This, as I said, so avoid growth and focus on reducing inequality. Who says this? I mean, I am not targeting the historian economist, but there is a body of economists who say that world should focus on reducing inequality. Therefore, these reports like Oxfam are highlighted so much, but the survey says that might be so in case of West, we can uplift more people by focusing on growth. How? It tries to prove it. See, economic growth and urbanization have helped to reduce poverty and to favorable socio-economic outcomes in the case of India and China. The China's example is very useful. In fact, recently a report was released by internal working group of RBI on agricultural credit. They also showed a China comparison, that how despite having in absolute sense less arable land and the size of average farming is smaller, still due to the unique institutional changes in China, the growth and productivity in agriculture is higher. Though historically speaking, comparison and learning from China has been tricky. I mean, those of you who have read Bipan Chandra's book on post-independence, you will see that a few delegations from India during Nehruvian period went to China to study cooperative farming, and they were bamboozled and they by Chinese Communist Party authorities into thinking that only by bringing institutional changes you can increase productivity without increasing investment. They came back, suggested very happy and very strong, having strong faith in cooperative farming, and pushed government of India in that direction. However, due to democratic problems, that we could not pick it up. So I mean, a comparison with China is always tricky, though the comparison given in survey appears to be robust. Although they said, look, inequality went up, that is correct, but we reduced poverty as well. Okay. Now, this is a comparison, inequality and economic growth between Indian states and the West. First, health index, and they have shown many such comparisons on different parameters like education, murder rates, drug abuse, infant mortality, maternal mortality, etc. We are picking only few of them. Look, Gini coefficient. Now we know Gini coefficient is used to measure inequality. 1 is perfect inequality, 0 is perfect equality. Okay, in India's case it has been going up. We are talking about Indian states and some Western countries. It shows that though the inequality goes up between different Indian states, see the graph goes up. Despite increase in inequality, we have better health index. Why? Due to the economic growth. If we have economic growth, if net state domestic product goes up, we will uplift, we will improve health despite increased inequality. However, this is not the case in West. See, more income inequality has led to a decline in health index. This is the difference survey is trying to point out, that yes, focusing on inequality is fully justified in the case of West. But in our case, look, if despite increase in inequality, if there is growth, we still improve our socio-economic indicators. And they show many other graphs. Same, these are different Indian states and these are Western countries. See, inequality is increasing. As I said, 1 is perfect inequality and 0 is perfect equality. Inequality is increasing. Still, education index, the states, isn't it strange? Higher inequality, still higher education attainment. But again, in the case of West, more inequality, less performance. Now, they have taken Western countries, not states, Finland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, USA. Look, very high inequality, and look their maths and literacy level. Look at Finland, very equal society, very equal. So, higher education level. USA, very unequal, see the decline from Finland to USA. We all hear about the excellent socio-economic indicators of Scandinavian countries. This is one good example. Japan, low inequality, better. But in the case of India, now that is not to say, we are not saying that increase inequality, your indicators will improve. No, it is saying that due to increased growth, we are still, despite increase in inequality, we are able to uplift people. Similar contradictions exist in the case of life expectancy, total fertility rate, infant mortality, birth rate, death rate, homicide, percentage of current drug abuse, mental health. And the survey gives a detailed chart for all of them. Now, impact of per capita income. Impact of economic growth on improving socio-economic indicators is much more pronounced in the case of Indian states than the developed economies of West, what we have discussed previously. And it shows net per capita income. See, in the case of India, it's much steeper compared to that. Meaning, national increase in income is not improving life expectancy that much. For that, you will have to reduce inequality. In the case of West, you will have to reduce inequality to improve life expectancy anymore. But in the case of India, growth is more important. Similarly, correlation of inequality and life expectancy in the year 2004. This is 2004. and 11 in Indian states. We are talking about life expectancy. This is life expectancy, and again, despite increase in inequality, both in 2004 and in 2011. The life expectancy among Indian states is increasing despite increase in inequality, and infant mortality rate is decreasing despite increase in inequality. Why? Because of economic growth. Similar trends are observed in birth rate, death rate, total fertility rate. Point is simple: focus on economic growth. Yes, inequality will increase. Still, India's improvement on socio-economic indicators will improve, which is not the case in West. Now, relationship between inequality, Gini based on consumption. There are two types of inequality: based on consumption and based on income. The inequality based on consumption is more important. And poverty head count ratio in Indian states. Look, head, same thing is happening here. Okay. Trade off in China. It has there is a long box on it, but so that you can remember it, I have picked up two factual statements. The poverty has reduced by 94% from 1980 to 2015 in rural China. Remember rural China. At the same time, Gini coefficient of income distribution among rural residents rose from 0.241 in 1980 to 0.39 by 62%. You say yes, the inequality will increase in short term, but growth will uplift poor. The negative correlation between economic growth and multidimensional poverty in the Indian states proves that growth leads to poverty reduction. Now it says that not only absolute poverty, even multidimensional poverty goes down as the growth rate picks up due to negative correlation. Fifth chapter, healthcare takes the center stage finally. Obviously, this year, coronavirus, due to COVID-19 pandemic, the healthcare spending has gone up many times and we have realized finally that a good health system is so important. I mean, a crisis puts things into perspective immediately. Something similar has happened here. A known problem addressed with more urgency. There is not anything new in this chapter. It talks about same thing, that how there is the predominance of in private sector in India's health sector. There is lot of market failures because of information asymmetry, the shortage of manpower, including doctors, nurses, paramedics, the shortage of infrastructure, the shortage in public sector public sector expenditure as a percentage of GDP and what impacts it can have. The problems are well known, only the emphasis and the urgency is greater. That's the gist of this chapter. It talks about National Health Mission and Ayushman Bharat. It says great ideas, keep doing, improve. National Health Policy, it had certain goals like eliminating TB, reducing malaria related deaths, etc. It talked about increasing the public sector expenditure as a percentage of GDP so that out of pocket expenditure can come down. Telemedicine, COVID-19 has again increased emphasis on it. It has brought over many septic suicide. A key role of private sector, information asymmetry and information utilities. What is information asymmetry? If you remember, during the height of the pandemic, there was a lot of confusion about hospital beds. Now government would say that beds are available, but if you go to the private hospital, they would charge you an incredible amount of sum. Then they say, oh, we don't have beds, etc. This is one such example of information asymmetry. Due to information asymmetry, the cost of treating the same disease in private sector is much higher than in public sector. Okay, same problem exists in insurance sector. Information asymmetry in short, leads to exploitation. Exploitation of consumer, exploitation of patient. Therefore, it talks about information utilities. I mean, if in the bankruptcy sector we have information utilities, then why not in healthcare? For example, the policy bazaar. And this is very important. Just like SEBI regulates markets, just like RBI regulates banking sector, IRDIA, okay, Competition Commission, there are different regulators and adjudicators for different sectors. It says why not for health sector, given the fact there is lot of information asymmetry. This was the unique idea. Now it says that an increase in public spending from 1% to 2.5 to 3% of GDP can decrease the out-of-pocket expenditures from 65 to 3%. Look, such will be the impact of poverty on reducing poverty. We know it is one of the main factors that pushes millions of Indians into poverty each year. Now, see what we said in previous chapter, that focus on growth, it will reduce poverty. Don't mind inequality for now. If there is economic growth, if there is tax buoyancy, if there is increase in government expense, government's purse, then a simple increase, okay, simple increase of 1 to 2.5% to 3%, how much out of pocket expenditure will come down and how much it will impact poverty alleviation. Similarly, India is ranked 179th out of 189 countries in prioritization accorded to health in its government budgets, union and states, and this is by database, which is not a very new idea. We know our healthcare expenditure is rather low. We sit among the countries that are dependent on foreign aid. Then regulating healthcare. Substantial market failures in private sector healthcare. I mean, there would be no one who hasn't had at least 1 or 2 bad experience in private sector. Okay, I mean, some of the instances and stories are rather tragic, but we all know that due to information asymmetry, exploitation happens. So if there are credit rating agencies to mitigate market risk, what about health care sector risk? See, in previous chapter we talked about sovereign credit rating of nations, but even corporates are rated, even their bonds, their debt instruments are rated, and based on that rating, a potential investor decides that how safe is it, should I invest it, do I want to take more risk, do I want to take risk. In short, they bridge the gap between service provider and service taker. They reduce the risk. So why not in health sector? I mean, we have heard this example. There have been a lot of ads about Policy Bazaar, that you want to buy health insurance, go over there, compare policies so that you can buy best policies. Similarly, this is an idea of information utility, what we saw in the previous slide. Here, information utility. Policy Bazaar is one example, there could be a larger one. And NHS of UK and Affordable Care Act of US. These are 2 examples of a regulator in health sector. This chapter at the last contains many examples from Scandinavian countries, Australia, USA, UK. In Finland, they have in constitution that provides certain standards. In Australia, they have a framework document that controls standards. So this is in nutshell this chapter, and I have to repeat, the ideas are all same, it's just that they are expressed with more urgency, with 1 or 2 new ideas, like talking about a new regulator for health sector. So this is the gist of chapter 5. Again, I am repeating myself, the same ideas have been repeated here with more urgency. So this is the end of chapter 5. Rest of the chapters will be covered in the next video. Thank you very much.